EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and this is Brewing with Underwhelming Commanders, episode 39. And again, in this episode, I decided to go with a lot of newer commanders from sets that we've had come out this year for the poll. I'll show you here the actual results, and this is a first for me. I've done almost 40 episodes of Underwhelming Commanders, and I've never had a tie before. This is my first ever tie. Parnes, the Subtle Brush, and Denry Klin, Editor-in-Chief. We're tied for the top spot. And what do you do in that situation? Do you make both decks, or do I just pick one? Since it's my channel, I decided I would just pick the one that I want to build around, and I wanted to build around Denry Klin because I think it's a great commander that doesn't get enough love, and also I had a really janky fun idea to do with it. Again, I don't think Denry Klin is a particularly underwhelming commander. I think it's a pretty good one. So whenever I have a commander that is really unpopular but not necessarily underwhelming, I like to do a more janky fringe deck build with it, and that's what I did here. I went really jank with this. I could almost put this in my Building Janky Deck series because it's such a janky deck, but it's certainly going to be a fun one. So Denry Klin, Editor-in-Chief, 2 white and a blue cat advisor 2/2. Denry Klin, Editor-in-Chief, enters the battlefield with your choice of a +1/+1 first strike or vigilance counter on it. Whenever a non-token creature you control enters the battlefield, if Denry Klin had counters on it, put the same number and kind of counters on that creature. So when I was talking about this in my video of the best commanders from New Capenna, because I thought this was one of the best commanders, it's super interesting. The part I think that gets overlooked a little bit is that any counter that is on your Denry is going to go on your other creatures as well. It doesn't have to be the counters that you put on it with his ability. It can be a counter from any other thing. So if I put, for example, an Indestructible counter on my Denry Klin, every single creature that I have enter the battlefield is going to get an Indestructible counter on it. That seems pretty good to me, right? And the really interesting idea that I sort of came up with on the fly when I was talking about this guy before is this is just a great way to cheat counters on your creature. And so what is the most powerful sort of counter that I can put on a creature that I can cheat on it some other way? And I thought a really janky, interesting way to go with this is with the Myojin. The Myojin want to have Divinity counters on them, right? So Myojin of Cleansing Fire and Myojin of Seeing Winds were the original versions of this. Myojin of Cleansing Fire cost 8 mana, 5 white. That's a lot. It's a 4/6. When it enters the battlefield, if you cast it from your hand, it gets a Divinity counter on it, okay? So cheating it into play is not going to work here. As long as it has a Divinity counter on it, it's indestructible, pretty good, and also you can remove that Divinity counter to destroy all other creatures. Also really good. Myojin of Seeing Winds costs 10 mana, 7 blue, and is only a 3/3. But again, if you cast it from your hand, it gets that Divinity counter, is indestructible, and you can remove the Divinity counter to draw a card for each permanent you control. Both of those abilities to me seem like really fantastic abilities that we want to be doing more than once. And also, it would be nice to get these guys out a lot earlier and cheat those Divinity counters on them. That's what I'm going with in this deck. I put a Divinity counter on my commander, I cheat my Myojin into play, and it gets a Divinity counter as well. And also, I want to reuse those abilities more than once. Also went with the newer Myojins, which unfortunately have different wording, which hurts us here a little bit, but we still can work around it. So Myojin of Blooming Dawn and Myojin of Cryptic Dreams are the white and blue ones from Neon Dynasty. They are going to enter the battlefield with an Indestructible counter on them if you cast them from your hand, and you can remove the Indestructible counter to, with the white one, create a 1/1 colorless spirit creature token for each permanent you control. Pretty darn good. Again, another one that we want to repeatedly do over and over again, and Cryptic Dreams is going to copy target permanent spell you control 3 times. Now, of course, we're not doing the Divinity counter thing, so putting a Divinity counter on these guys isn't going to do anything. I mean, it will do something, which I will get to, but it's not going to do anything with their abilities. What we want is to put Indestructible counters on them. So we're going to have to go a little bit of a different direction with these guys. Regardless, what we want to do here with our Denry Klin is put an Indestructible counter on it, and we want to put a Divinity counter on it as well. Not a lot of ways to do that, but like I said, this is a janky deck, and I think it's a lot of fun. So first things first, we need some looting in this deck, right? Looting works really good here for a number of reasons, okay? So I got Careful Study, Frantic Search, some of the best looting cards in the entire game. First of all, we want to chuck our Myojin in the graveyard because we don't want to cast them. They're really expensive. We want to cheat them into play. So we got to put them in our graveyard first. Looting also works great in a strategy strategy like this because we're getting to very specific cards in our deck. Obviously, tutors is the best way to get to specific cards in your deck, but doing a whole lot of looting is a great way to dig through your deck and get to the cards you want and then chuck the cards you don't really need into your graveyard. So we got a lot of looting in this deck for a number of reasons. Obviously, we also are going to have recursion in here. I got loyal retainers, I got resurrection, I got quite a bit of recursion abilities in this deck. White does have quite a bit of really great recursion because we want to cheat our Myojin into play as well. But of course, we got to get those counters on our commander. And there's a couple of ways, believe it or not, that we can do this. That which was taken is probably going to be the best, right? 5 mana legendary artifact, pay 4, put a divinity counter on target permanent other than that which was taken. Each permanent with a divinity counter on it is indestructible. So we get that nice little added bonus of, yeah, we want to be putting divinity counter on our commander, of course, but now our commander is also going to be indestructible. So that's a nice little added bonus, right? We also can obviously just use this to put the divinity counters on our Myojin as well, right? If we don't have our commander in play, we can just put divinity counters on our Myojin after we cheat them into play, or after we already use the ability, right? If I have my Myojin of Cleansing Fire in play, I can board wipe, destroy all other creatures. Keep in mind, our Denry Klin is indestructible because it has a divinity counter on it, so our commander sticks around, and probably a lot of our other creatures as well, because everything with a divinity counter on it is indestructible as long as that which was taken is in play. So again, we got some hoops to jump through here, but once we get to the place we want to get, we can really go to town. Board wiping all of our opponent's creatures over and over seems pretty good. Then we can put another divinity counter on our Myojins on Cleansing Fire, do it again the next turn. So this just becomes 4 mana, destroy all of our opponent's creatures every single turn. Seems pretty good. Obviously works with our Myojin of Seeing Winds as well. If we need to draw some cards, drawing like 5 or 10 or however many cards every single turn, that also seems pretty good. A lot of hoops to jump through here, but the payoff is really there, and I think it's worth it. Kindred Boon is another way we can do this. There's actually a couple of cards that are dealing with divinity counters. 2 white enchantment. As Kindred Boon enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. So the creature type thing is a little bit tricky here. If we want to put the counter on our commander, we have to choose one of our commander's creature types, right? Because Kindred Boon says pay 1 and a white, put a divinity counter on target creature you control of the chosen type. We can't just put a divinity counter on any creature here. So we can put the divinity counter on our commander if we choose cat or advisor. Maybe that's what we want to do, because then we put the divinity counter on our Denry Klin, and now all of our other creatures when they enter the battlefield are also going to get those counters on them. We don't have to use our Kindred Boon to put the counters on them. We can just use our commander's ability to do it, and each creature you control with a divinity counter on it is indestructible. Again, it's doing something similar to that which was taken. And by the way, those 2 cards overlap, right? Each permanent with a divinity counter on it is indestructible. That includes the divinity counters you get from anywhere else, right? So anything referring to divinity counters is all going to work together here. Now, another way you could go with this, if your Denry Klin maybe already has a divinity counter on it, you could cast your Kindred Boon and choose Spirit here, because of course all of our Myojin are spirits, and this is a great way to repeatedly put those divinity counters on our Myojin so that we can use those abilities over and over again, right? So these cards that are putting divinity counters on our Myojin are a combination of, if I cheat my Myojin into play, I can now put a divinity counter on it because it's not going to get it unless I cast it. But if I actually cast my Myojin and it does have the divinity counter on it, because that could happen, now I can just put divinity counters on it so I can repeatedly use the ability over and over again, right? So it's doing a number of things in this deck. So Kindred Boon and that which was taken are probably the 2 most important cards in this deck. I think I did put Enlightened Tutor in here so that we can go tutor for it. Obviously this gets artifacts and enchantments, so we can get either of them with Enlightened Tutor. I think it has to go in this deck. However, as I already mentioned, those other Myojins, the new ones, they don't do with the divinity counter thing. We want indestructible counters on them, and there's only one way to do that in Azorius colors, and that is with Tyrite Sanctum. Tyrite Sanctum, of course, is a land, taps to add a colorless, pay 2 and tap, target legendary creature becomes a god in addition to its other types, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Then we can pay 4, tap, sacrifice Tyrite Sanctum, put an indestructible counter on target god. So we want to be doing this on our commander, right? We want to turn our commander into a god, and then we want to put an indestructible counter on it so that all of our other creatures get indestructible counters on it. I think probably Tyrite Sanctum is an auto-include in a Denry Klin deck. It's already putting the counter on your commander, which all your other creatures are going to get, so that seems pretty good. And then the indestructible counter as well. So if I was making a Denry Klin deck, no matter what I was doing in that deck, Tyrite Sanctum seems like a great include. Another phenomenal include is Nesting Grounds here. Again, if you're doing any sort of a counter theme, this just seems like a great include in your deck, of course, because you can pay 1 and tap, move a counter from target permanent you control onto another target permanent. And there's going to be a lot of situations situations, I think, where you're going to want to be doing this, whether it be moving those counters from your other creatures onto your Myojin. Again, our other creatures are going to enter the battlefield with these counters as well, right? So if I just have my Trinket Mage, say, come into play, which I have in this deck, and I will get to why I have it in this deck right away, it comes into play, it's going to get a Divinity counter or an Indestructible counter. We don't really care that it's on our Trinket Mage, right? We don't want it on there. We probably want it on one of our Myojin, so now Nesting Grounds can move that counter from our Trinket Mage onto one of the creatures that we really, really want it on. So that's a fantastic fit. And of course, I have Trinket Mage in this deck because I really want my Expedition map, and we're really jumping through some hoops with the tutoring here. Expedition map, of course, is going to go get Nesting Grounds or Tyrite Sanctum, which are really, really important lands in this deck. I also have Weathered Wayfarer and Taloria West, both great ways in Azorius colors to tutor for lands because those lands are so important in the deck. I can also, with my Trinket Mage, go get, of course, the Ozolith, which is another phenomenal fit in any deck where you're doing counters, right? When a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters of any kind on it, you put those counters on the Ozolith, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, if the Ozolith has counters on it, you may move those counters from the Ozolith onto target creatures. So again, this is a great way to shift those counters around if we need to and put them on the creatures we want them on. There's been a lot of really, really great support recently. Of course, a lot of it was from New Capenna that work in this strategy of just dealing with counters of any kind. So Aven Courier, for example, 1 in a blue, bird, advisor, 1/1 with flying. When it attacks, choose a counter on a permanent you control, put a counter of that kind on target permanent you control if it doesn't have a counter of that kind. So again, we got a Myojin, we removed the Indestructible counter or the Divinity counter or the whatever. Now we can choose the counter that is probably on our commander, because our commander will likely have these counters on them all the time, and copy that counter essentially and put it back on the Myojin or whatever we want it on. So that's a great fit in the deck. Resourceful Defense, another fantastic fit here. 2 in a white enchantment. Whenever a permanent you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on target permanent you control. So now again, if we have our Denry Klin in play, let's say our opponents destroy it or path to exile it or something, get it off the battlefield, all those counters that were on our commander, maybe the Divinity counter, the Indestructible counter, we can now move those onto another creature, probably a Myojin. Also has 4 in a white, move any number of counters from target permanent you control to another target permanent you control. So again, doing that whole Ozolith Nesting Grounds thing where we can move the counters around to the appropriate creatures we want it on. Contractual Safeguard, 2 in a white instant. If you cast a spell during your main phase, put a shield counter on a creature you control. And of course, we want to put that on our commander because then all of our other creatures will enter the battlefield with a shield counter on it. More importantly though, choose a kind of counter on a creature you control. Put a counter of that kind on each other creature you control. So at any point, if our commander dies, maybe we have a bunch of Myojin in play that we don't have the counters on. Now we can put a counter on one of those creatures and then use this to put that counter on every other creature, including our commander. Phenomenal fit in the deck, of course. You're probably asking the question though, our commander enters the battlefield with our choice of a +1/+1 first strike or vigilance counter on it. Which one of those are we going to choose? I think probably the easiest one to choose is the +1/+1 counter one. You could do a very interesting first strike theme here, maybe. You could do a vigilance theme as well. Like, I know a vigilance theme doesn't seem great, but Meekstone, for example, work really, really great in a deck where all your creatures have vigilance because, of course, they're not tapping to attack. Your opponent's creatures are going to get locked down and yours are going to be fine. That's just an interesting way to go with it. I went with the +1/+1 counter theme, which works really, really well with Persist. So I have Cauldron of Souls in here and Glenelendra Archmage. Once we sacrifice our Glenelendra Archmage, of course, it comes back into play with a -1/-1 counter on it, but it's also going to get a +1/+1 counter on it because of our commander. And for those who don't know, they cancel out, right? If you have a -1/-1 counter and a +1/+1 counter on a creature, they essentially just vanish. They cancel each other out. So all those counters will disappear. So this is a way that we can repeatedly use our Glenelendra Archmage over and over and over again. Cauldron of Souls will work the exact same way, where we can now choose any number of creatures and give them Persist. And when they come back into play, as long as our commander is in play with a +1/+1 counter on it, they're all going to get counters as well. And we can Persist again. So it's a repeatable board wipe protection effect. So that works really great in the deck. A couple other counter themed things that we're doing here. Of course, Lazal, Blackest Champion is a great fit. If you would put one or more counters on a creature or planeswalker you control or on yourself, put that many +1 instead. So now again, if we put a Divinity counter on one of our Myojin, we're going to get 2 instead. So now we get to use those abilities twice. The Indestructible counters as well. Angelic Sleuth, whenever another permanent you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, investigate. So that seems like a pretty good fit in the deck. I put As Foretold in the deck because this is just a phenomenal card card in a commander game, and we're doing the counter theme, and I think it fits here. We do have a lot of proliferate effects in here, like Skyship Plunderer, Thrumming-bird, because we also want to be proliferating those counters on our Myojin. That's another thing we can do with them. Rather than just I repeatedly put Divinity counters on my Myojin, I can have a Divinity counter or an Indestructible counter on there, and I can just proliferate it. So that works as well, and it all works with As Foretold, and you know what, might get up to the place where you have like 8 counters on your As Foretold, and you can actually cast your Myojin of the Cleansing Fire, for example, from your hand for free, and you are actually casting it from your hand even though you're not paying the mana value for it, so it will get the Divinity counter on it when it enters the battlefield. So I thought that was a good fit as well. It's just a great card in a commander deck all around. Together Forever is in this deck because, of course, just a great fit in any counter theme in white, of course. And I put Planar Birth in the deck, which people probably see that and go, why is this in the deck? I put this in a deck a long time ago in my Dagon Blackblade deck that I did on my Underwhelming Commander series, because I thought really it is maybe one of the best ways to ramp in the entire format if you're doing it the right way, right? So you're going to pay 1 and a white and return all basic land cards from all graveyards to the battlefield tapped under their owner's control. Now, I suppose if you have an opponent that is playing a Gitrog deck or something, they're probably going to get a lot of value off of this, but it's likely that your opponents probably won't have any basic lands in their graveyard at all. And we're going to have a bunch because, of course, we are discarding like crazy. Don't forget, there's a lot of looting in this deck. I put a ton of looting in the deck for, again, the number of reasons that I already said. We want our Myojin in the graveyard, but also we want to be digging through our deck to get through the appropriate things. So later in the game, I can cast Planar Birth for 2 mana and very easily get 4 or 5 or 6 basic lands out of my graveyard, put them directly into play, right? This card can sit in your hand for a while. You know, if this is in your opening hand, just let it sit there. You can just sit there for 5, 6, 7 turns until you get to the point where you're like, okay, I got 4 basic lands in my graveyard. Now seems like a good time to cast my Planar Birth. And of course, again, we do have those really expensive Myojins that maybe at some point we actually do want to cast them from our hand possibly, right? So I thought that was a pretty neat include in the deck as well. Really interesting deck here. This is a pretty fun commander, and I thought, you know what, I really like this idea of it just puts any counter on your creatures when they enter the battlefield. So I'm gonna go with a really janky, interesting theme here, and this definitely is one. It requires a lot of setup, but like I said, once you get going with this whole strategy, just I draw a bunch of cards repeatedly over and over on my turn, or I destroy all other creatures over and over again on my turn, or I create an army of 1/1 colorless spirits over and over again every single turn. That seems like it's worth all the hoops that you have to jump through. So hopefully you guys can make it work. Of course, the deck list for this is in the description below. As always, feel free to check it out if you want to, but that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.